So today we're in, sorry, it's not lecture 3, it's lecture 1 of unit 2. So that's a mistake on my behalf. Today we're going to talk about European contact colonialism and colonial representations. And just a warning in advance, some of the things I'll be quoting about people who've been writing about the Pacific, Europeans after European contact, colonials. Not everything is nice to read or hear. It's a very sensitive lecture in that respect. It's also sensitive because it's me giving it to you. Of course, I'm a white person. The fact that I'm here is influenced by the colonial times. I did my PhD in England. And I wouldn't have done my PhD there if England did not have a colonial past with Fiji. So yes, it is kind of strange that I'm presenting this to you. On the other hand, I guess it's also a positive sign. The fact that I, as a white person, can criticize the Europeans and the colonials and the impact they've had and, ways of looking forward. So I definitely don't associate myself with the things that I'll be saying that have been written by Europeans. But yes, I am a European. So there's a nice contradiction. So yes, some of it will be offensive, but we're going to discuss it because these offensive descriptions have had a real impact in the Pacific and still have an impact today. So bear in mind some of it, it's not nice to hear. We're going to talk through it. It's something that you need to be aware of to understand the situation of today in the Pacific. So there's no way we can get around it, but discuss it in your tutorial as well. And discuss in relation to the topic question that we've listed for today's tutorial. So Unit 2 on its, as a whole this week is about colonial and post-colonial context in the Pacific. And the learning outcome of Unit 2 is to contrast the colonial and post-colonial contexts in the Pacific. So again, we're not asking you to memorize exactly who became independent when, who was colonized first, by who. We want you to be able to contrast these specific time periods, its impacts in the Pacific, what happened. So you need to be able to describe this and talk about it and feel comfortable. So this lecture is about European contact, colonialism, and colonial representations. And the learning outcomes of this lecture and the tutorial is to be able to discuss the effect of European contact in the Pacific region. So again, it's not just about facts, it's really about an understanding that you're able to discuss. And discuss the impact of colonialism in the Pacific region. So again, be able to talk about it. What is the impact? Can you come up with examples? So key concepts are European contacts, the terms Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. I'm going to discuss these terms and that they are inventions. They're impositions by Europeans on the Pacific region that have led to categorization that Pacific Islanders have now adopted as well. So I'm not going to give you any specific definitions. We'll be discussing them in detail. Colonialism, of course, everybody has an idea about colonialism, but a definition would be the control or governing influence of a nation over a dependent country, territory, or people. And this can happen in multiple ways. So we need to go back before we start to understand the impacts of European contact and colonialism. So we've talked about migration in the region, early migrations, wayfinding, that everybody is connected in a way to each other because of the migration waves in the Pacific. And then you need to think about the imposition of these categories of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia that separated people, that categorized people that were normally related to each other through historical migrations. So we're going to talk about the mindset of Europeans a little bit. It's odds. They were very, you can say, full of themselves. They thought they were superior. They were going to conquer the world. They were going to discover islands that had never been discovered before, which of course isn't true. Pacific Islanders were there already. So the whole mind frame of Europeans and what you know about the Pacific region is awkward, is silly. And they were very full of themselves, basically. So here you can see a photograph of a globe that indicates that Europeans thought before they discovered, which they didn't, of course, there were already people there, that the Pacific Ocean that we know now was empty and that there was a continent on the south at the bottom that kept the Earth in balance. There was nothing in between. So here you can see a globe that indicates this. The making of these globes and maps is something that's very European when you think about, you know, the flat maps drawn, maps that we still have today of the world, of Fiji. These are all very Western ways of finding, navigating your way in the world, getting an overview. And it's important to realize that maps are never neutral. They're very much influenced by what the person who's making the map deems important. So even today on the world maps you can see sometimes Africa is bigger, sometimes Asia is bigger. And this is really political as well, depending on who made this map and who wants certain places in the world to look bigger than others. So it's very much a representation of who Europeans were and what motivated their interest in the Pacific, for example. So what were the motivations of Europeans for the mapping and the naming of the Pacific, the naming Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia? And how did they view the people they encountered? And what are the consequences of their mapping and naming today? That is what we'll discuss in this lecture. So here is the first map that was created with information by Tupaya. This is a Tahitian priest of the oral religion and navigator. Very interesting person. If you want to look him up, there's a lot of information now on the internet on Tupaya. And this map was drawn by somebody who listened to what he had to say about where the location of certain islands were, and oral history. Now it's important when you think about that map and Tupaya's indigenous view of what was drawn that it's different. This is a European way of mapping, of seeing, navigating, controlling. But Tupaya, of course, was a navigator. So he wouldn't look kind of from the top and see islands located in specific locations, latitudes, etc. He would look at the stars and the seas, his oral knowledge that has been handed down, swell patterns, etc. He would be looking for the direction from his canoe instead from up above, where you have then that nice overview of a map. So this is an example of a Pacific map instead of the drawn maps. This is a meadow stick chart from the Marshall Islands. It's from the middle 19th century. It's collected by Robert Louis Stevenson. Some of you may have heard of him because he's quite well known in Samoa. And this is a mnemonic device for navigators. So you can barely see it, but shells here indicate islands where sticks cross each other. That's where swells come together. So you can see that these charts are very important and they would be remembered. So you would learn through these charts where islands are, where swells merge, and then they would literally be discarded. You would have to memorize it. This is not something you would take on a boat. So what were the European motivations for the mapping and giving the region new names? Because there were already existing names given by Pacific Islanders. So Europeans thought they had superior races and cultures. They were superior. And they tried to classify the people in the Pacific through racial and cultural typologies and differentiate themselves, the Europeans, in comparison to them. So by creating racial and cultural typologies, Europeans kind of distanced themselves from the Pacific Islanders they encountered, and they classified themselves as more superior based on what they encountered and categories they placed on development, looks of people. So in this process, Pacific Islanders became distant from each other as well. So this is very important to remember when you think about the map, the migration waves, the wayfinding, and then that imposition of categories. Pacific Islanders are categorizing themselves now as well. You talk about Melanesians, Polynesians, Micronesians. So influenced by the scientific interest and ideas of the time when Europeans started to explore, a person named Forster established a gradation of the Pacific people that he visited on Cook's second voyage. So some of you, I hope most of you have heard of James Cook and his exploration in the Pacific. If not, just Google him, very famous. So this is a description of Forster for his classification of Pacific Islanders that he encountered. The one more fair, well-limbed, athletic, of a fine size and a kind, benevolent temper. The other, blacker, the hair just beginning to become woolly and crisp, the body more slender and low, and their temper, if possible, more brisk, though somewhat mistrustful. So here you can see early indications of a classification that is more negative towards darker-skinned people and more positive towards fair-skinned people. Now remember that these are ideas imposed by Europeans. They're not true, huh? But this is what was said. That's why I'm reading it to you. So in the first group, he ranked Tahiti and the Society Islands, the Marquesas and the Friendly Islands, also Tonga, Easter Island and New Zealand. So the more fair one, the one that he thought was nicer. In the second category, New Caledonia, Tanna and Malakula. So this classification was made before James Cook traveled to Hawaii. Therefore, Hawaii is not included in this, but it would have been categorized in the first category. And the same for more northern islands later classified as Micronesia. So how did we get from this ranking to D'Urville's famous labeling and mapping of the Pacific into the regions Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia? It has been influential in that. So here you can see a European map. These were prestigious objects, and they were elaborately decorated, cost a lot of money. And here you can see the Micronesia. This was Melanesia and Polynesia. See, it stretches wide. So Dumont d'Urville invented these terms. They did not exist in the Pacific before. And this is all based on a paper that he presented to the Geography Society in France. So this all happened outside of the Pacific region. And he suggested to divide Oceania into Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. And ever since that paper, human and social scientists have used this terminology when referring to the Pacific. And in 1984, he wrote an introduction, 1884, sorry. I name, and thereby declaring that these places in the Pacific were called Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia. And this was taken as a given, a scientific fact. And therefore they became common knowledge, not among Pacific Islanders, Europeans. And these names went into textbooks at schools, and they were used on maps. And common knowledge, things that you would call common knowledge, is very often referred to as harmless. But of course, in this case, it's not. They've had huge impact. They were not a matter of map making and geography, but the actual terms are also a qualification of a categorization of race based on fairer skin, darker skin. So D'Urville claimed these ideas to be his own, but Forster introduced the categorization of Pacific Island people based on race 2 centuries before him. So they are a racist invention. And D'Urville links the racial division of Forster to the regional division of Malaysia, Polynesia, Micronesia. And he refers to them as the copper-skinned people, and Melanesia as the black-skinned people. Now, if you remember the description I gave you by Forster, the categorization of more fair-skinned people and darker, you can see that it immediately came with positive and more negative connotations. Now, Melanesia included Australia, New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Santa Cruz, and also Fiji. So it was said that in Melanesia, people lived in a sort of barbarity, no laws or formal ceremonies, and there was a constant strong aversion to Europeans. In addition, this is in juxtaposition to the more fair-skinned Polynesians. And these societies seem to be organized into kingdoms and nations that were very reminiscent of the kingdoms in Europe. And therefore, they seem to be more civilized. And this was particularly so for Tahitians, Tongans, Hawaiians, but also the New Zealand Maori. So D'Urville also raised the status of Fijians because they seem to have absorbed aspects of Tongan Polynesian society. And why did he think this way? Why did he think he, had to categorize people who were already in a region, had their own names, were all related to each other? This is the kind of academic circle, the mindset of Europeans as the superior race and the scientific academic circles that they were in. And he was in a circle of physiologists, botanists, who sought to understand the human race and human variety through Georges Cuvier's tripartite model of white, yellow, and black races. Again, very silly when you think about it, but that's what they were doing. So these terms are all inventions. So the invention of Melanesia. Melanesia was a term that did not originate from D'Urville, but was introduced by Bory de Saint-Vincent in 1825 to refer to and distinguish the blacks of the Pacific, of the Negroes of Africa, the black people that they encountered in Africa. Again, if you must be aware of the negative views of black people in Africa who were then also made slaves. A similar attitude was adopted to the Pacific. And it was Bory de Saint-Vincent, based on Cuvier's general model of human classification based on skin color, which is ridiculous, who was responsible for the unfortunate invention of the term Melanesia. And Melanesia, Mela means black, for if you didn't know that. The invention of Polynesia. Charles de Brosse in 1756 introduced the term Polynesia to refer to all the islands in the Pacific Ocean. And this is a quote: "Our globe is made up of 3 large expanses of land, Asia, Africa, and America, and 3 large expanses of sea, the Ethiopian or Indian Ocean, the Atlantic or Northern Ocean, the Pacific or Southern Ocean, and in relation to this, we can even divide the unknown southern world into 3 parts, lying south of the 3 mentioned above, one in the Indian Ocean to the south of Asia, that I will call for that reason Australasia." So again, there is this like, I will call, I will name. Another that I will name, Magellanic, after the man Magellan, who discovered it. I shall include in the 3rd everything contained in the vast Pacific Ocean, and I shall give this part the name of Polynesia, because of the many islands it encompasses, from Polis, Multiples, and Nissos Insula. So again, this is, there were already people living there with names, but he just thought he would name it. So naming the region Polynesia was very strategic by him, He wanted to persuade the French court, who would provide money for explorations, to send exploratory expeditions to the Austral Islands. And these should be discovered without any delay. So again, discovered. There were already people there. The southern continent would then surely be found, you know, the southern continent that would be at the bottom of the globe to keep it in balance. And the Pacific would probably conceal many spice islands, which would be good for their trades to generate an income. So the other one is the invention of the term Micronesia. So Dominique de Rienzi presented a new chart of the Great Ocean at a meeting of the Geography Society in 1831, and d'Urville was there. So you can see by the names all Europeans, like French or Italian, Spanish. And de Rienzi distinguishes 5 areas with 4 races in it that were differentiated based on skin color again. Among the fair-skinned people, he distinguished between Polynesian people, who inhabited a smaller geographic area, and called them the people of Micronesia, the small islands. So what we also refer to now as Micronesia was initially still considered part of Polynesia, and later got a different name. Now, d'Urville started using this term to further divide the Pacific region based on race before the paper de Rienzi has presented and was published several years later. So he actually stole his idea about the term Micronesia. So what were the European motivations for all this mapping and naming of the region? Europeans attempted to plot differences in the Pacific region through racial, cultural, typological differences, because they said they were superior and they would qualify everybody else based on them. And by creating racial and cultural typologies, Europeans distanced themselves from the people they encountered in the Pacific region. They were more superior, so they could name, could give new names, could treat them in certain ways, could make judgments. However, in this process, over time, Pacific Islanders became distanced from each other as well. So that's kind of the main message that I want to give to you in relation to European contact and naming and labeling and current negative associations with darker skinned people and Melanesia and Polynesia. And we'll get into that more later. But we also have to discuss colonialism, which happens afterwards. So it's important to understand that in the time of European contact, Pacific Islanders actually entered into trade and exchange. It wasn't a case of, oh, they come and we're just going to be subservient to them. No, there was actually interaction, some beachcomber states on islands, and this changed in the colonial times. When the colonial times started, inequalities that were present already, I mean, you think about the labeling, and they strengthened. So in the 1880s, there was actually competition among colonial powers, mainly Britain, France, and Germany. And this intensified for prestige, strategic and economic gain in the Pacific. So there was an imposition of colonial peace, you know, civilization. We're going to colonize them and we're going to civilize them, and etc. But this was established at a high cost. There were, as a result of more and more Europeans coming in, colonials, they brought diseases with them. So there were lots of epidemic outbreaks. There was an erosion of traditional beliefs that by the Europeans and colonials and the mission were considered uncivilized. Which again, I know that some of you agree with it. I don't. It's just different. I don't think you can say Pacific Islanders were uncivilized before the mission came, or the Europeans or the colonials. It's just different. So there was an increasing dependence on money and imports in the Pacific. There was European American settlement in Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia, and Hawaii. Phosphates for fertilizers was actively mined on some islands, causing environmental disturbance. And you know maybe the example of the Bonamans who had to leave as well as a result of phosphate extraction. Colonial governments collected taxes, recruited labor, local labor. They took land from people for plantations or gold mining. And there is the blackbirding that took place. Slave traders further contributed to the depopulation and cultural loss by forcing Pacific Islanders to work in mines and on plantations, for example, in Australia, Queensland, or in Peru, South America. So I have two videos here. They're quite short. For those of you who are not familiar with blackbirding, but if you want to know more about it, you can have a look on the internet. There's quite a lot of information on it, and very good documentaries.
I would like to take you on a journey. Can you imagine you're with your brothers and sisters playing on a beach and a small boat pulls up? As you and your siblings approach to take a closer look, you're grabbed and pulled into the small boat. Some of your siblings escape and run. However, you're forced in, and before you know it, you are leaving the shoreline and the beach where you played and the village where you lived. You are then taken to a large ship, put into a hold, where there are other children just like you. Here you sit, afraid, and wish you were back in your village. As the days pass, more young people are thrown into darkness with you. Eventually you are let out of the hold and into the sunlight, clothed, and you are marched off with a group of other young people, taken away. Eventually, ahead of you, you see fields of sugarcane. As a young woman, my great-grandmother was one of the few young women amongst the young men taken from their village to work in the cane and other primary industries on which this state of Queensland was made. These were young, strong men and women with strong cultures, languages, and came from vibrant, traditional village and family lives. My name is Sonia Minicon. I'm a proud descendant of the Cubby Cubby people of southeast Queensland, but also of the people of Vanuatu, and I'm a direct descendant of the people of Ambram, Pentecost, Umbai and Gower. So to acknowledge my ancestors and my culture makes me proud. And to honour the women who have shaped me and many of our Australian South Sea Islander families, it just seems like the right thing to do this year. It's 150 years since the first legislated landing of the islanders brought to Queensland for the sugar industry. The work was backbreaking, many became sick, they became weak and many were injured. If they were lucky, they were also able to work in homes as domestics, cleaning and cooking and caring for the children of plantation owners. I often wondered how they mustered the strength to do this work and endured the hardships, but their ability to hold on to their beliefs and newly found faith made these women even stronger. So they grew into staunch and protective wives and mothers. Many also cared for their extended families and communities in which they belonged. The generations of women that were born out of the first recruits grew up with the living knowledge of the struggles of their parents and mothers faced. There was blatant mistreatment and deliberate racial discrimination and a growing push for these families to feel like they didn't belong here. But as women do, they persisted and grew. We were proud and hard-working people with strong family connections and support, and the women used this as leverage to grow and succeed. We as Australian South Sea Islanders have withstood the test of time, persevering and protecting our families, and I'm proud to say that I'm a descendant of the women of the trade.
So there's, I'll just turn this down again. There's quite a bit of information on this, if you're interested. It is quite shocking to see, and there are some very horrible accounts by people of places where this happened. But I think it's important for you to be aware of all this. I noticed in last year's Flexi that many did not know about this. Slavery was more associated with Africans and not the Pacific. So another thing that's very important to realize when you do research in archives or museums, history books, the maps, etc., that Europeans are the ones who left written accounts and became the dominant power. And it's their testimony that has influenced our understanding of Pacific Islanders. And as a result, until quite recently, indigenous voices have been silenced or marginalized. Indigenous Pacific Islanders did not write down. That was an oral history. Things were passed on orally. It's a very European thing to write things down and record. Pacific Islanders were equally exposed to different experiences of cultural contact, which they transmitted to their descendants via oral traditions that, again, have not been recorded properly. So this is something that increasingly research is being done on now to fill the gaps and have a more balanced understanding of this time period. So there is a gradual increase in research that tries to shed a new light on this time period, a more Pacific Islander-centered history. And an example is Robert Nicole's book, Decolonizing History, which is very interesting if you want to read it. It's in the library. So when you think about the impact of Europeans and colonialism in the Pacific, we can speak about a double vision, because Pacific Islanders have since the late 18th century been partially transformed by these encounters and ways of thinking and imposition of labels. And Epeli Hau'ofa, in his article of 1994, writes that outsiders' representations of the Pacific matter because islanders have in part come to see themselves through the outlanders' lenses. For example, not being civilized before Christianity was adopted, or the invention of the handsome white Polynesian, which is actually invented by the Spaniards who were looking for the Solomon Islands and based on accounts were expecting a specific looking person, and they ended up in the Marquesas Islands and encountered more fair people with a Polynesian type of society. So these kind of stereotypes or these images, representations, are kept alive through films. So these are quite old films, but they're all about the Polynesian maiden, the beautiful Polynesian woman. And here you have examples of TV series that are still out there that keep this idea alive. You don't see Hawaii 5-0 in Papua New Guinea. It's in Hawaii. And there's a reason for it, I think. It's based on these existing ideas about the kind of sexy Polynesian women. And it's also kept alive through widely read, reputable magazines like the National Geographic. Here, French Polynesia topic, and then this beautiful woman is used on the front. Travel planners who have beautiful women on the cover pages. And then the more negative view of Melanesia is still kept alive through works such as that of Paul Theroux. I don't know if you've heard of him. But it's a widely read book in the West, of course. It's called The Happy Isles of Oceania. And he writes he found the Solomon Islanders to be the most savage islands in the Pacific when he traveled through. So by describing them this way, based on his expectations, his Western ideas, he keeps this distinction alive. And this was it was a bestseller. So he also wrote negatively about Fiji. He wrote negatively about other places, but predominantly, the more Melanesian places. And Kambutalaka argues that it's because it fed the Western imagination of Melanesian backwardness and savagery that this was something that was accepted and people liked to read about it. So again, the double vision. These classifications exist not only in European minds, but also in the minds of Pacific Islanders. And it has somewhat been internalized by many of you. And this is reflected in language that you use, your perceptions of other Pacific Islanders, relationships among Pacific Islanders, and the use of descriptions such as black thing to describe a Pacific Islander. And this has actually happened to my husband, who is quite dark. It's often made fun of. He's from Rewa. And overseas, other Fijians would call him Kaloaloa. And I said, well, why would you call him black thing? That's very offensive. He's a person. And, you know, he's darker than you maybe. But immediately calling him black thing made it such a negative, you know, it had a negative association. He's a person and not a thing. And this, I found this happens more and more. There's a lot of jokes, you know, about color. My brother-in-law doesn't want to come to the beach with us because he then gets darker. I was like, but that's nice. And he says, no, I don't want to become darker. So there is something, you know, I'm sure you know a lot of examples and jokes that are made, swear words, negative associations. So it's very much something that is still done by Pacific Islanders too. Now, Melanesia has gradually acquired a more positive meaning for those who want to use the term to assert a Melanesian identity with pride and thereby establishing a new reality. So Melanesianism, the Melanesian way, celebrates diversity as a source of strength rather than weakness, and pride in being the darker skinned people of the Pacific. Now here is Solomon Islander Prime Minister Gordon Darcy Lilo, who has called on Melanesians to rise up to the challenges facing their region and find their place among the nations of the world. Melanesians have to assert themselves and obtain their place in the sun. So there are multiple ways that you can read this, find their place in the sun. But I think it's very important. There needs to be an awareness of the impacts of these names and these labels, and then start to undo them. So Pacific Islanders need to acknowledge how European contact, naming, mapping, the mission, and colonialism have influenced how they perceive and relate to each other, and to be able to work together towards common goals. And how would this be done? You could emphasize interconnections prior to European contacts, and you can establish a more pan-Pacific identity, not letting go of your personal ones or where you come from. So this was introduced, this idea was also introduced by Ratumara at the United Nations in 1970. He said we need to start talking about the Pacific way of doing things instead of the Melanesian, Polynesian, Micronesian way. And Hau'ofa has suggested a common identity based on the sea that connects everybody, to be able to come together to work towards common goals. So this is kind of then like a positive note after quite confrontational topics. And I hope that you will discuss it further in your tutorial and look up anything else that you want to find out, or ask your tutors or me if there's anything unclear. It's quite important that you understand this properly, that there are no misunderstandings. Thank you very much. The next lecture will be on Wednesday. Friday there is no lecture because of the multiple choice test. We haven't been able to book this venue, but we have the venue, the OS 8, from 1 to 3. It's a bigger space, it's a bit cooler. It gets very hot in here. So the multiple choice test will be on Friday from 1 to 3 in the OS 8 theater. Yeah, we'll all do it together at the same time. Thank you very much. Have a good day.